First of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to share some of my work. I'm always extremely excited to discuss your perspectives about some of the things that I've been working with. Perhaps a little bit about myself. I didn't prepare a presentation slide on this, but so as it was introduced, I work interdisciplinary. I'm working sort of with the application of economic theory into understanding digital museums. Specifically, but I also work, since I hear that Ecom Austria, and I forgot to mention this, but I'm also part of the board of CIDOC, which is the International Council of Museums, International Committee on Documentation. And so I'm very glad to hear there's lots of talk about harmonized vocabularies and linked open data and these sort of things, because in CIDOC, this is what we try to advance in museums throughout the world. So if you're interested also in talking about this, next conference will be in, since we are doing some of the preview information here on CIDOC, on Ecom, so our next conference will take place in Geneva. It's mostly a Francophone community, but as we all know, Switzerland is extremely international, and so I'm sure things will be actually German, French, and English. So please take a look or feel free to ask. So let's see, in terms of this presentation, so let me get started. So I have about 20 minutes to talk about, whoops, I'm sorry. And I somehow cannot see the slide I'm looking at here. Anyways, so maybe can somebody help? No? Okay, I'll just figure it out like this. I just don't have a clock, so maybe I'll have to ask somebody to wave me for the clock. So what I would like to argue is precisely that what we imagine as a museum without walls might not be necessarily what everybody imagines, or maybe we have different ideas on this, and so I would like to open a discussion on what do we imagine precisely as an information without walls. So this meeting is about mostly our museums. Our museums are full of pictures, and pictures tell stories. But also stories can be told with any picture. So potentially any story can be told with any object from the museum. I've done some research on the history of digitization. My case study was the Netherlands, and I brought a couple of exemplaries, physical exemplaries. You can find this online for free download. I looked at how Dutch museums adopted computers since the 1960s. And what's interesting is that the goal of remote access and federated searches has been since the start, the primordial goal, but it's still a challenge. So looking, as Christian well said, looking into a museum's collection information, archive, and library is still a challenge, as well as looking throughout, beyond your museum, but into the collections of other museums. So this is the federated search. As probably other speakers will talk more about, the software and new hardware developments to develop these augmented experiences will probably facilitate this broader access. But what I will want to argue at the end is that very much museums can become the key repositories in the information economy. And I'm sorry, I'm really distracted because I cannot see my slide, so I'll have to see how. So if I see it here, and this is in German, so maybe that's why I cannot see it. Yes, I am in. Oh, somebody's coming. Thank you so much. And so, starting with beautiful Vienna. Any guesses where this image comes from? So some of the people know the image or can read. This is a woodcut from the Nuremberg Chronicle, 1493, self-scanned by a contributor in, of course, my favorite online repository, Wikipedia. So Wikimedia is the repository to use images in the online free encyclopedia. And generally museum content or libraries or archives, the GLAMs, take part in the historic aspect of the articles, but you can find them also in other places. So as I was preparing for this visit to beautiful Vienna, I looked on my DuckDuckGo, and the second hit was TripAdvisor, of course, so what should I not miss when I come to Vienna? And then I was looking, okay, where am I going, what's going on? So I look in the Google Maps, of course, I tick museum, and then you get this selection. I just randomly looked at this natural history, and you can see collections, you can streak walk and this sort of thing. But I was very much interested in the art museum, the pictures. And so I went further into what Christian already mentioned, the Google Art project, in which you find actually 23 collections in Vienna. So I looked at Vienna, and this is what I find. So I was scrolling these gorgeous pictures, some of them lovely high-res. And this is just a random sample, this lovely bird chariot. I'm looking forward to try to find it on my Saturday museum visits. And then you see a second object from a museum in Italy. This is a Stradivarius. Why is any guesses why this will be related to Vienna? Apparently, there is some certificate given by a Vienna expert, and so then this metadata is linking this to Vienna. The third object is from Cebu, from Romania. A lovely young lady painted by a Romanian artist. Any guesses why? Link collection. The artist studied in the Art Academy in Vienna. And so seamless, I visit, from Vienna to Italy to Romania, music, objects, paintings, in this sort of closed environment, but still very fluid environment. You can also look at buildings. You can walk through and look at some of the objects on the bottom. And then I wanted to see some of the museums, in fact, what did they show in collections. And I'm not going to show Belvedere because I'm sure somebody else will, but I looked at this Albertina. In the collection section, English, there's a lady with a cat. I clicked on it. This is all the information I got. You can barely see it. Curious. Okay, so what's another place to look at collections from Vienna for all the museum workers? How many people work in museums from here? Yes. Okay, so what's our favorite location for searching things? Europeana. So this is what I find. So some sound recordings. Okay, I wanted art, so I filter images, and then I get the view on your right. So not really exciting, eh? So how did we get here? So again, influenced by my research, I looked at the Netherlands as main case study. Curiously, it was the Ministry of Internal Affairs who gave a huge fund available for what they call the Delta Plan to administer collections. Their interest was to see what do we have, how much does it cost, and how much is going to cost, let's say, to preserve it. So what's the state of it? Almost 20 years later, there was the first report with the estimation of the full Dutch collection, which was 45 million objects, and their value in terms of their importance to the nation. So 15% were category A, and these are the objects that you cannot miss. 24% were category B. These are objects that are important for your museum. Then you have category C, which are objects that you have in your collection. And category D is just sort of the props in your exhibits. This 45 million, it was the counting then. But then we have a new Naturalis Biodiversity Center with 37 million objects. So this obviously doesn't work. So the counting needs to be done again. And what you find with these accounting exercises is that first, what is it that you're counting, or how are you counting? Then as museums go further with finding boxes in their storage rooms, then they start to count objects differently. Some museums are starting to count objects in their archive, and so on. So the countings change. in terms of the registration of objects and to do these sort of countings, how do we start? So in the bottom, you see what most of museums in Europe are working with, which is this whatever software system. Where does that come from? You know, maybe an earlier version of a computer system, maybe some spreadsheet or some Word text processing. And some museums already started working with the punch cards. And where does this come from? Probably from an earlier version of a harmonized basic registration system brought from the library, so quite short and beknopt, summarized. But most museums, many work actually double with the paper acquisition logs, in which you have an inventory number where the museum comes from, maybe a drawing identifying it and some information. And so you see sort of how it has transformed. If you look at these information systems, they very much tell how do museums perceive their knowledge. A number of them are still very static systems. A few museums have tried to play with other things. As you saw earlier, it was all text-based. Now there's a little bit more image-based systems. So the Vienna is an example that plays with the color scheme of the objects. The other example is geo-based location of the objects in the collection of the New York Public Library. How have museums in the Netherlands adopted computers? The first line is just general computers. So, you know, relatively soon, many museums had tons of computers, mostly for HR, for administration, basic stuff. The next line is the orange line. This is museums adopting the internet. So you see relatively fast now everybody has a website. Maybe not their own website, but at least a Facebook profile. But if you see the slowly raising line in gray in this chart, that's museums adopting computers for object registration. So it goes a little bit slower. As Christian has mentioned as well, is because of harmonized vocabularies, getting agreement on, you know, what standards we're using and so on. The yellow line is the slowest growing line, that's objects online. In 2015, it was estimated that about 25% of the collections were available online, museums. Now there's maybe a 30%, but this also has to do with how you count. So it used to be just registration of objects. Now we expect an image to be counted as registration, so the data can sometimes change. Still, this ideal of remote access and federated searches is a challenge, since so little of our collections are available online, able to be linked, you know, hindering this lovely picture of linked open data. From Europeana's 2020 strategy, they have estimated that of the 300 million objects online in their repository, in their, it's not repository, in their portal, this accounts for about 10% of European heritage. This includes libraries, archives, as well as museums. So you can see this is a major task. Of course, expense, and most of it is labor. Because we know that digitization is not just mass scanning to get an image. Some objects are a little bit trickier, but it also requires registration, documentation, contextualization, storytelling, and further connections. These are not yet automated processes. It's very much labor intensive. And so not everybody is able to do this. However, some museums, like the Rijksmuseum in Twente, so not in Amsterdam, but another city, this is a curious example. They have a small staff, small resources, and if you see their general page, it's just like anybody museum. However, when you click on one of the objects, you find a full picture, high-res, and then you see the general basic registration information and a little blurb about the object. But below, you have all these other links to a YouTube page of a fan who loves this author and this type, this genre. You have links to other Dutch museums, including Boijmans van Beuningen. And they also often link to RKD, so this is the the Office for Dutch Art History. They also link to Wikipedia, because somebody else has already written about this author and about flowers as a genre and about this period and so on, so why should they do it again? So this is kind of the library approach. You pull resources, to do the basic documentation that anybody can tap into. As Christian well mentioned, to do this kind of work, digitisation in museums, you need a policy and financial framework. In Europe, luckily we have this Digital Agenda 2020 that accepts digitization and preservation of culture as, our cultural memory. And they recommend that when museums have content in public domain, they should digitize it so that it remains in public domain. From Enumerate survey, it seems that only 13% of collections of museums have copyright for a third party. So that should not be the reason for not publishing online. In terms of the EU directive on the reuse of public sector information, in which museums and libraries and archives fall into, access to information is considered as a fundamental right. To ensure greater access to and the reuse of cultural materials is also considered an considerable economic opportunity. And to the argument that, well, yes, museums, we have all these costs and we can't just give everything away for free. Well, the EU directive suggests that museums should also be able to charge above marginal cost in order not to hinder their normal running. And for this, they could look at calculating this, looking at the private sector on the reuse of identical or similar documents, so, some sort of guide into looking at how much should you charge. But this is a little bit tricky, because when you are charging for the reuse of open data, is it for certain uses or for certain users? When asking museums about their perception of technology, there's many surveys about this. I picked one from Swiss museums. Museums were asked, well, what do you think of open data? And they said, yes, it's desirable. But they felt extremely uncomfortable about giving it away for free for somebody else to make money out of it. So commercial use is a no-no, but that's not open data. They also felt extremely uncomfortable with moral rights. So they don't want anybody else tweaking with their pictures and changing things or modifying them. So images should not be modified. In terms of crowdsourcing, what did they think of crowdsourcing? And they said, well, open data is interesting and crowdsourcing might be, but it's more of a risk than opportunity. In my research, I came up with some of the benefits of crowdsourcing. In 1.5 years, the crowd was able to clean up and do some work that would have taken 18 years for one staff to do. This is something then to consider. The issue with crowdsourcing is that, as we know, museums like to keep their information systems quite authentic. They have not figured out a way to mix different information sources. The previous example of the Rijksmuseum Twente, they had their own data and then clicks to further data. But to ingest somebody else's input, like the crowdsourcing does, into your own information system, this is not really, technically has not been solved, or maybe emotionally has not been solved. One example is the the Amsterdam Museum has done Intangible Heritage crowdsourcing, and in this way they have managed to keep their object information system different and separated from the intangible information system. Another example of crowdsourcing looks at niche sourcing. So the Rijksmuseum collaborated with bird experts to identify the types of bird in the collection. So you could help, and this information is very much taken into their information database, but you see, as Christian also said, these parallel worlds, and you have the art history's story, and you have a bouquet of flowers, And then you have the scientific story in which you say, now, all flowers cannot bloom at the same time. But in our history it works, right? In terms of audience participation, then we see that crowdsourcing is very much has benefits of high speed, low cost, and engagement. And the information systems appear to be limited if you only want to talk about the object rather than the stories that can be told, and these multiple stories that can be told at the same time. I've been working recently with this concept of the crowdsourcing as a way to bring people together and engage them in creating this new information system, a la Wikipedia. So it will be a socially constructed digital commons. And so you will have the audience emotionally engaged with an interest to see this project go further beyond perhaps the limited funding projects of the project. In terms of the value of the museum information, we know it's extremely valuable, but somehow museums seem shy to want to share this with the rest of the world. But other parties have very much identified this value, like for instance Google, to train their algorithms. We see this Google Book project is very much behind the fantastic algorithm behind any search. And you see increasingly images for also working with the Google Art project. One of the newer projects, and I'm not going to show the video, but you can find it, is this Stadia new algorithms by Google, in which you can color your video game a la Van Gogh, a la Delaunay, a la Klimt, a la. And so, as you can see, you take an image, a painting, and then you overpost it into your video game, and so you get the color scheme and the texture in the imaging. Another example of private third parties using museum collections is video gamers on the room, is the Assassin's Creed, this video game in which you go and killing people. But you can also have these non-killing people. Well, I think you also kill people, but it's the heritage version. It's an edition celebrating their 10 years. And when you walk around, you encounter things, and sometimes you can find additional information. This comes from the Museum in Leiden of Antiquities. The museum did not know about this. They were happy to see that their collections and their information is being reused. Another example of museums not knowing is this Netflix series, Alice Grace, or something. The Museum of Sweden heard that their objects in their collection are used to give to dress the period rooms. Curious, they also didn't know about it. So in terms of the value of museums as information, we know that museums have these millenary, very, very rich repositories, organized, classified, authentic, diverse information. This is very rich in the information economy. This digital technology can contribute to reposition the museum as a key agent to enrich the service information economy, positioning museums everywhere beyond their walls. But being everywhere, as I show, requires perhaps a new value framework. So again, if you cannot charge for Google or for Netflix or any video game for using your collections, how do you make this value argument? So clicks on your website is not enough. So we need a new framework for this. And so with this, I would like to end and perhaps open for discussion if you still have time for some questions on how do you imagine then this true digital museum without walls. Thank you.